My wife said she settled for me. I didn't argue. Thursdays have always been emotionally suspicious days. They lack the manic, desperate energy of a Monday, where the week's potential still feels like a weight you might actually be able to carry, and they lack the exhausted, honey-thick surrender of a Friday evening. A Thursday is a hallway, long, dimly lit, and leading somewhere you aren't entirely sure you want to go. It is the day when the optimism of the week has evaporated, leaving only the grit of routine behind. It was on such a day, at exactly 8:42 p.m., that my wife decided to perform a casual public autopsy on our marriage while the patient was still breathing. The setting was L'Artisan. Sarah had picked it, of course. She possessed a biological radar for places that appeared on top 10 listicles, venues that sold an experience of authenticity while being entirely manufactured. The restaurant was a monument to modern pretension, an industrial chic aesthetic, which in practice meant paying a premium to sit on reclaimed metal chairs that punished your spine, surrounded by exposed brick walls that seemed to weep condensation. The lighting consisted of Edison bulbs suspended from frayed black cords, casting an amber glow so dim you could barely read the menu. The menu itself used words like curated, infused, and reduction to mask the fact that the portions were insultingly small and the prices were predatory. I sat across from her, adjusting my tie for the third time in 10 minutes. I felt like an artifact in a natural history museum, well preserved, properly dusted, but ultimately inanimate. Sarah, however, was in her element. She understood lighting better than she understood her own husband. She knew exactly how to angle her chin so the shadows carved out her cheekbones, giving her the look of a tragic, beautiful heroine in a film no one had invited me to star in. To her left was Chloe, a woman whose career in PR had given her a voice with the exact frequency required to cut through tempered steel. To her right sat Marcus, a man whose ego was so vast it required its own zip code. Marcus measured human worth in terms of social media engagement and the thickness of one's watch casing. I was the silent partner in this tableau. I was the provider, the background character, the human credit card with opinions she tolerated with a thin, condescending smile, the way one listens to a child explain a toy that you already know is broken. I had paid for every meal like this for a decade, not because Sarah ever explicitly demanded it, but because somewhere in the slow erosion of our early years, it had become my primary function. The conversation at the table had been a swirling vortex of gossip and superficial status updates until Chloe leaned in, her eyes shining with the predatory glint that usually accompanied her third glass of Chardonnay. "Sarah, babe," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial register that demanded the attention of everyone within a 3-table radius. "I was looking at those old photos from your gallery opening years ago. You were such a firebrand. Such a rebel. Every guy in that room was terrified of you. And then there's Arthur." She said my name like it was a sensible pair of orthopedic shoes. Comfortable, perhaps necessary for long walks on gravel, but nothing you'd ever show off on a runway. Sarah laughed. It wasn't a laugh of genuine amusement. It was a musical, practiced tinkle, a signal for the table to pay attention because she was about to say something clever. She swirled her Pinot Noir, watching the legs of the wine streak down the glass like tears. "Oh, Arthur," Sarah said, glancing at me briefly before returning her gaze to her audience. "He chased me for 6 months. You have to understand. I was in such a strange place back then. I just ended things with Julian. Remember the kite surfer? The one who lived on a beach in Bali and forgot his own birthday? My life was a mess of adrenaline and disappointment. I was exhausted. I was tired of men who were like fireworks, brilliant for a second and then leaving you in the dark." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the amber light catch the gold of her necklace. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The air in the restaurant suddenly felt too thick to process. "Arthur was just there," she continued, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "He was consistent. He was predictable. He was like that old sweater you keep in the back of the closet. It's not the one you wear to impress anyone at a party, but you know it'll keep you warm when the power goes out. I figured, why not? He was a very comfortable place to sit down after a long run." Chloe let out a sharp, jagged giggle. Marcus smirked, swirling his own drink. I waited for the punchline, the part where she would say I was the love of her life or that my stability was her greatest treasure. But the punchline never came. Instead, she leaned back, looking entirely too comfortable in the wreckage she was about to create. I mean, let's be honest, Sarah added, shrugging her shoulders with an air of casual confession. I settled. The word settled didn't just float in the air, it curdled the oxygen in the room. It was a judge's gavel hitting wood. It wasn't an insult thrown in the heat of an argument. It was a statement of fact, as mundane to her as the weather. The word settled didn't just hang in the air. It vibrated. I didn't react right away. My brain did that strange, defensive thing where it tries to protect you by replaying the sentence slower, softer, hoping you misheard. I hadn't. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at Chloe and Marcus, seeking the validation of her own wit, like I was a prop in her narrative, a footnote in the grand story of her exciting life. Chloe tried to laugh it off, but even she seemed to realize the blade had gone too deep. Marcus suddenly became very interested in the garnish on his steak, his loud bravado momentarily silenced by the sheer, casual cruelty of the woman across from him. I just sat there, not frozen, not shocked. I felt clear. Suddenly, a decade of moments I'd ignored lined up like receipts in an audit. I remembered the jokes at my expense that I'd smiled through to keep the peace. I remembered the way she corrected my grammar in public, as if I were a child. I remembered the way she talked about me to her friends while I was sitting right there, as if I were a piece of furniture that had recently been moved into a more convenient corner. Safe, she used to call me in the early days. I used to think that meant I was her sanctuary. I thought it meant she saw me as a man of character, a man who could be leaned on. Now I realized safe was just a polite synonym for boring. I was the safety net she used to stop her fall, and now that she was standing on solid ground, she found the net to be a nuisance. No woman with real options would choose him for the thrill, Sarah continued, emboldened by the lack of pushback. She said it casually, as if she were explaining basic math or why one chooses a mid-sized sedan over a convertible. But options are exhausting, aren't they? Sometimes you just want a man who knows how to pay the mortgage on time and doesn't give you any trouble. That's when I understood something vital. You don't humiliate someone you respect. You only reveal how you've always seen them. I signaled for the check. When the waiter arrived, he sensed the atmospheric pressure drop at the table. I slid my card over like muscle memory finishing a task. My hand didn't shake. I wasn't angry yet. I was simply finished. I stood up. The movement was enough to break Sarah's flow. She looked up, her expression shifting from performative wit to slight annoyance. "Where are you going? We haven't had the flourless chocolate cake yet," she said. "I'm going home, Sarah," I said. My voice was level. It was the voice of a man reading a weather report for a city he no longer lived in. "Don't be dramatic," she laughed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Sit down. We're celebrating Marcus's promotion." "I'm not being dramatic," I said. "I'm being safe, and a safe person knows when the party is over." I walked out of L'Artisan alone. The cool night air hit my face with a sharpness that was far more honest than the dim amber warmth of the restaurant. It's funny how the body reacts after the mind is done pretending. My lungs finally expanded, taking in a breath that didn't feel like it was being shared with Sarah's expectations. I didn't call a cab. I didn't check my phone. I simply started walking. The 3 miles back to the house felt like a necessary pilgrimage. With every step on the cold pavement, the layers of the background character I had played for a decade began to peel away. I thought about the word options. Sarah had always been obsessed with them. To her, a choice was only valuable if it was made against a backdrop of alternatives. If I was the only one left when the music stopped, I wasn't a choice. I was a forfeit. I reached the house with the artisan light fixtures she'd picked, and the minimalist furniture I'd paid for. And the silence inside was deafening. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark living room, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the ceiling like searchlights looking for a survivor. I realized then that settling is a two-way street. She had settled for a man she didn't respect, but I had settled for a woman who didn't see me. I had traded my self-worth for the illusion of a stable home. I had played the provider until I had nothing left to provide but a signature on a check. An hour later, the roar of her car in the driveway broke the silence. The front door slammed with a violence that felt performative, a precursor to the lecture she had undoubtedly rehearsed on the drive home. She marched into the living room and flicked on the overhead light. The brightness was blinding, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. "You have a lot of nerve," she hissed, dropping her designer clutch on the marble island. "Walking out like that? Making everyone uncomfortable? You made me look like a bitch, Arthur." I looked up at her from the sofa. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to apologize for existing. "You did that yourself," I said quietly. "I didn't have to say a word. You told the story. I just provided the ending." "It was a joke," she snapped, her voice rising. "Everyone was drinking. It's what people do. They talk, they tease. You're being incredibly sensitive. You're overreacting to a few glasses of wine and some dinner table banter. A joke has a punchline, Sarah. You were just stating a philosophy. You told them that no woman with options would choose me. That was the most honest thing you've said to me in years." She opened her mouth to argue, but for a second she faltered. The silence between us grew, no longer filled by the noise of her friends or the clinking of glasses. It was just us, and the truth was a cold guest in the room. Sarah stood by the marble island, her chest heaving with a mixture of indignation and a sudden, sharp tremor of something she couldn't quite name. She was used to my silence being a form of submission, a quiet space she could fill with her own noise. She wasn't used to this version of my silence, a cold, impenetrable wall. "I was talking about the past," she said, her voice wavering. "I chose you, didn't I? I'm here, aren't I?" "You're here because you're afraid to be anywhere else," I said. I stood up, and for the first time, I felt taller than her. "And I'm here because I thought I was building a life with someone who saw me. But you don't see me, Sarah. You see a utility. You see a safety net." I walked past her toward the bedroom. The air in the hallway felt thin. I pulled a suitcase from the top of the closet, the large, sturdy one we had bought for our honeymoon in Tuscany. It felt heavier than it should have. "What are you doing?" she asked, appearing in the doorway. Her voice had lost its edge. It was replaced by a hollow, brittle curiosity. "I'm packing a bag," I said, not looking back. I began grabbing shirts, the ones she liked, the ones she had bought for me to make me look presentable for her gallery friends. I realized I didn't even like the color of most of them. "Don't be ridiculous, Arthur. You're not going anywhere. You're just hurt. We'll talk about this in the morning when you've had sleep. We can even look into that therapy retreat Chloe mentioned." "To talk about how you settled?" I asked, finally turning to face her. "To pay a professional to tell you how to tolerate the man you've already told the world you don't respect?" "No, Sarah. The audit is done. The accounts are empty." I watched her face as the reality finally began to sink in. She wasn't losing a lover. Not really. She was losing the architect of her comfort. She was losing the man who made sure the bills disappeared, who made sure the car was serviced, and who provided the stable background that allowed her to be the firebrand she so desperately wanted to remain. "You're really going to throw away 10 years because of one night?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm not throwing away 10 years, I said, zipping the bag with a final decisive sound. "I'm stopping the clock before it hits 11. I've spent a decade being a person you figured why not choose. I'm interested to see who I am when I'm the first choice." I grabbed my keys and my coat. As I walked toward the front door, the house felt like a stage set after the play has closed. Hollow, wooden, and waiting to be dismantled. The click of the front door behind me was the most definitive sound I had heard in a decade. It wasn't a slam, it was a lock engaging, a final punctuation mark on a chapter that had run on for far too many pages. I stood on the porch for a moment, the bag in my hand feeling like an anchor I had finally decided to lift. I drove to a hotel near the airport, a place of beige walls, generic art, and complete anonymity. It was perfect. There were no artisan light fixtures here, no memories of public humiliations disguised as dinner table banter. I checked in under my own name, paid with my own card, and walked into a room that didn't know I was a safe man or a consolation prize. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like something I needed to fill with an apology. Back at the house, I knew what was happening. Sarah would be pacing the hardwood floors, her phone in her hand, alternating between fury and a creeping, icy panic. She would be waiting for the safe version of me to text her, to tell her I'd cooled off, that I was sorry for being sensitive, and that I was coming back to make things right. That was the script. That was the role I had played with such relentless consistency that she had forgotten I was a human being with a breaking point. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. "You're being cruel now," the message read. You know I didn't mean it like that. You're embarrassing me further by leaving. I looked at the screen. Her first instinct wasn't to ask where I was or if I was okay. It was to manage the optics. Even in the wreckage, she was worried about the embarrassment. I realized then that she didn't miss me. She missed the stability I represented. She missed the man who absorbed her blows and remained standing. I didn't reply. I turned the phone face down and lay back on the pillows. The silence of the hotel room was expansive. It was the silence of a blank page. For years, I had defined myself through her lens, the provider, the reliable one, the man who settled her life. Now, without her gaze to define me, I felt a strange, weightless sensation. It was terrifying, but it was also the most honest I had felt in 10 years. I fell asleep to the sound of distant planes taking off, carrying people to places where no one knew their names. The next morning, the sun was indifferent. It rose over the city just as it always did, unaware that the world as I knew it had ended on a Thursday night. I went down to the hotel lobby and ordered a coffee. Black, no sugar. I sat by the window and watched the world go by. I thought about the next few days. There would be lawyers. There would be the division of assets. There would be the inevitable phone calls from Chloe and Marcus, pretending to be concerned while looking for more gossip. But as I took a sip of the bitter coffee, I realized something important. I wasn't just leaving a marriage. I was leaving the version of myself that was willing to be a second-best option. The following Monday felt like a funeral for a person who was still walking around. I spent the morning in a glass-walled office downtown, watching a lawyer named Miller move a yellow highlighter across a spreadsheet of our lives. Houses, cars, joint savings accounts, the 401k I had meticulously managed while Sarah spent her creative freelance income on gallery fees and vintage rugs. She called 3 times this morning, Miller said, peering over his spectacles. She seems to think this is a misunderstanding. She mentioned something about a dinner party? It wasn't a misunderstanding, I said. It was a confession. She just didn't realize there was a witness to her own truth. Well, Miller sighed, leaning back. The witness owns 50% of the assets. In this state, it doesn't matter if she's settled or not. The math remains the same. The math. It was funny how it all came down to that. For years, Sarah had treated our marriage like a series of complex, abstract equations. Her beauty, plus my stability, her social standing, plus my income. But now, the variable of my compliance had been removed, and the whole formula was collapsing. When I left the office, my phone was a graveyard of notifications. It wasn't just Sarah anymore. The social circle, the options she was so proud of, had begun to react. Chloe had texted, "Arthur, babe, don't be like this. Sarah is a wreck. We were all just joking. You know how she gets when she's had a few drinks. Don't blow up your life over a silly comment." I deleted it. Then came Marcus. "Hey man, let's grab a beer. You can't just disappear. Who's going to help us with the logistics for the Hamptons trip next month?" I stared at Marcus's message. The logistics. They didn't miss Arthur. They missed the man who organized the rentals, paid the deposits, and made sure the wine was chilled. I was the infrastructure of their joy, a utility they took for granted until the power went out. I went to our house, her house I already felt, while she was at her yoga class. I needed more than just a suitcase. I walked through the rooms looking at the artisan decor. I realized that almost nothing in this house reflected me. The books on the shelves were hers. The art on the walls was her taste. Even the scent of the candles was sandalwood and mist, a smell I had always found slightly nauseating but never mentioned. I went to the basement and found a few boxes of my old things, the ones she had deemed too cluttered for the main floor. My old college journals, a collection of vintage cameras, the heavy wool blankets my mother had knitted. These were the fragments of the man I was before I decided to become safe. As I loaded the boxes into my car, I saw Sarah's car pull into the driveway. She didn't look like the glowing woman from the restaurant. Her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked ordinary. "Arthur," she breathed, running toward me. "Please, just come inside. I've canceled everything this week. We can talk. We can fix this." "There's nothing to fix, Sarah," I said, closing the trunk. "You told the truth. You just hate the consequences of it." "I was just trying to be interesting," she cried, her voice cracking. "You know how they are. I felt like I had to justify why I wasn't out there living like they were. I didn't mean you weren't enough." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of pity. That's the problem, Sarah. To you, I was only enough if you could explain me away to people who don't even like you. This is part 8 of the story. The narrative explores the contrast between Sarah's desperate social maneuvering and Arthur's quiet, radical reclamation of his own identity. Part 8, The Ghost in the Machine. The following week, Sarah switched tactics. The frantic, tearful voicemails stopped, replaced by a calculated silence and a surge in her social media activity. It was a digital offensive. She began posting throwback photos of our early years, trips to Italy, sunsets on the coast, captioned with cryptic, poetic nonsense about valuing the quiet strength of the long game. She was trying to rewrite the narrative. To our friends, she was the devoted wife mourning a sudden, inexplicable midlife crisis. She was painting me as the unstable one, hoping that the weight of social pressure would force me back into my safe box. I watched it from a distance, like an outsider observing a strange, tribal ritual. It didn't make me angry. It just confirmed that she was still performative. Even her grief had a filter on it. Meanwhile, I had moved into a small, furnished studio in a part of the city she used to call uninspired. It was a neighborhood of diners, hardware stores, and people who worked with their hands. There was no exposed brick. There were no Edison bulbs. The lighting was fluorescent and honest. One rainy Tuesday, I found myself in a small hobby shop at the end of the block. I walked past the model trains and the remote-controlled planes until I found the photography section. I picked up an old, manual 35mm film camera. It was heavy, cold, and mechanical. I remembered then that I used to spend hours in dark rooms, breathing in the scent of chemicals and waiting for a moment to reveal itself on paper. Sarah had hated the clutter of my equipment. She had told me that digital was more efficient for her social media brand. So I had packed the cameras away. I had traded the darkroom for the boardroom to ensure she had the options she craved. I bought the camera. I bought 10 rolls of black and white film. I spent the next few days walking the streets, not as a provider or a background character, but as an observer. I took photos of the way the rain pooled on the asphalt, the way light hit the faces of people waiting for the bus, the way the city looked when you weren't rushing to a restaurant you couldn't afford. I felt a strange, humming energy returning to my limbs. I wasn't safe anymore. I was unanchored. I was a man who could be anything, because the person who had spent 10 years defining me was gone. One evening, my phone rang. It was Chloe. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but I decided to answer. I wanted to hear the sound of that world one last time. "Arthur, honey, listen," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Sarah is throwing a small healing dinner this Thursday. Just the inner circle. She's really hurting. We all miss the old you, the guy who kept us all grounded. Why don't you just show up? No pressure, just dinner." I looked at the rolls of film drying in my small bathroom. I looked at the manual camera on my desk. I thought about the inner circle, a group of people who celebrated a woman for admitting she settled for the man who paid for their wine. "Chloe," I said, my voice calm, "I'm busy this Thursday." "Busy? Doing what?" "I'm developing something," I said. "Something that isn't for show." I hung up. I realized that Sarah wasn't trying to win me back because she loved me. She was trying to win me back because the inner circle was starting to see the cracks in her life. Without the safe man in the background, she was just another woman with a loud voice and no foundation. The healing dinner passed without me, but the echoes reached me through the digital grapevine. Apparently, the evening had been a disaster. Without my presence to act as the stabilizing force, the one who quietly handled the wine, the bill, and the awkward lulls in conversation, the group's dynamic soured. Sarah had spent the night trying to perform the role of the abandoned wife, but without the background character to play against, her performance felt hollow, even to Chloe and Marcus. A week later, the official divorce papers were served. It was no longer a misunderstanding or a break. It was a legal dissolution. Sarah called me, and for the first time, the performative wit was gone. Her voice was raw, stripped of its musical cadence. "You're actually doing this," she said, the realization finally breaking through. "You're taking half of everything, the house, the savings. You're gutting my life, Arthur." "I'm taking half of our life, Sarah," I replied. "The half I built while you were busy settling. You wanted options? Now you have them. You have the freedom you told everyone you missed." "I can't afford this house alone," she screamed. It was the scream of someone realizing their safety net hadn't just moved, it had vanished. "You're leaving me with nothing." "I'm leaving you with exactly what you said I was," I said. "Options. You're a firebrand, remember? You're the one who didn't want to be tied down to a sweater. Well, the sweater is gone. You're on your own in the cold." She hung up, and for the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a clean slate. I went back to my dark room, focusing on the image emerging in the chemical bath. It was a photo of the restaurant from the outside, dim, pretentious, and small. From this side of the glass, I could see how fragile that world really was. Sarah had spent 10 years convincing me I was lucky to be hers. I spent 10 minutes realizing she was lucky I stayed. The audit was final, and for once I wasn't the one paying the price. 6 months later, I met Sarah one last time to sign the final papers. We met at a generic coffee shop, not a top 10 destination, just a place with decent caffeine and plastic chairs. Sarah looked different. The glow of the Edison bulbs had been replaced by the weary lines of a woman who had to learn how to manage her own life. She had moved into a smaller apartment, and the inner circle had largely evaporated once the free wine and the Hamptons trips stopped. Marcus and Chloe had moved on to a new, safe couple to entertain them. "You look well, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of its old condescension. She looked at my hands, stained slightly with darkroom chemicals. "I hear you're showing your photography in a local gallery." "It's a small space," I said, "but every photo in there is mine. No filters, no justifications." She signed the last page and pushed it toward me. "I really did love you, in my own way," she whispered, a final attempt to salvage her narrative. "No, Sarah," I said, signing my own name for the last time as her husband. "You loved the security I provided. You loved the reflection of yourself you saw in my devotion. But you never loved me because you never bothered to see who I was." I walked out of the shop and into the bright afternoon sun. I wasn't headed to a meeting or a curated event. I was headed to the park to meet a woman I had met at the gallery. She was a restorer of old books, someone who understood that value isn't about being new or thrilling, but about being authentic and enduring. When she saw me, she didn't look past me or use me as a prop. She smiled, and for the first time in my life I knew I wasn't a safety net or a comfortable sweater. I wasn't the man someone settled for. I was the first choice. The hallway of the Thursday audit had finally led to an open door, and I walked through it without looking back.